to drink.
Welcome back to On the Mind. I'm Austin.
I'm Bryce.
I'm Duncan.
And apparently we need to drink. But tonight we're going to be talking about Russia and North Korea in that order, just depending on the time we have. We're going to be talking, first of all, about Russia. So the War Games are coming up. And to explain that, we have our local Duncan.
Okay, so this is kind of an interesting situation in that a lot is being made out of the Russian War Games this time around. It's kind of an interesting one because, of course, we have had a lot of tensions with Russia over the past year and even prior to that.
Duncan, that's fake news.
The tensions certainly are not fake news. I mean, you can't really deny that. But be that as it may, the interesting thing about this is that the collective NATO war games and the Soviet or Russian war games, depending on the era, that are usually stationed around the same time, are kind of always viewed with a certain level of importance in that they usually are simulating the ability of each individual group to defend its own borders and to launch an offensive against the other in the event of a general war. Historically, these games have actually been really well controlled. So, in fact, even in very heated climates, say, for example, the Cold War, NATO and Russia, well, NATO and the Soviet Union, I suppose I should say, would largely broadcast where the war games would take place, about what would happen, so as to avoid any sort of misunderstanding with the other that would seem to be suggesting real military action. At this point, again, a lot is being made of this, but this is really just another in a long line of more or less annual war games that seems to be controlled fairly well, except as we're going to hear from Bryce in a while, a particular incident that perhaps was not expected.
All right, so let's just start with basic stances then. Obviously, if this is something that happens, it's controlled. I'm all for them demonstrating their own military might if they feel like doing it. I wouldn't want to have a military parade in D.C., but it's a topic all on its own.
I was going to say, that there has been some talk of that.
Only one idiot, but you're right. We'll go ahead and move on to Bryce. What do you think about all this?
What I think about all of that?
Sorry, about the Russian thing, not our orange idiot.
All right, well, let me just say real quick about war games. I can see the benefit, sort of, like the Cold War thing, like, oh shit, we as two countries, or, as the entire world, could really tear each other up. So, let's just not have war because we see. But on the other hand, like, that stuff costs a lot of money. And, I mean, yeah, the military budget's huge, but I don't know. It could be spent.
Well, we all agree that it shouldn't be as huge and indefinite as it is. But I digress. Duncan, do you have anything for basic stance before we move on to the economic section?
Basically, in terms of this, I see this in a historical context as just another in a very long line of peaks and valleys of American-Russian relations. Right now, we are definitely in a valley as far as how we're relating to one another, certainly spurred on by the events of the last year. But, again, I don't really see this as some sort of gigantic shift in the historical context that we've seen over, say, the last 30 to 40 years.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I guess all in all, this isn't unexpected. It just seems a little more in the current climate than what it is.
Sure, and I will also point out that the same was true of the NATO war games, which were held not too long ago.
That's true.
They were more aggressive than usual. They were certainly meant to send a message, and that is a component of this, is it's always the two respective superpowers kind of sending the message that each one is ready for war. And in a sense, that actually has some constructive benefits, because, I mean, I'm sure we all, have talked about mutually assured destruction as a military philosophy enough.
Super mad.
That
Anybody?
That we can see the benefit of continuing to broadcast the general balance of military power through these sort of exercises it does tend to reinforce that concept. So I think they do have some constructive benefits. To Bryce's point, though, I will also agree that in our case, and especially for Russia, there are probably better uses of the money.
All right, so let's just move on to your section. Let's talk about the economic costs and implications. It's not unusual in the U.S. to put economic sanctions on people we don't like.
Not at all.
Yeah, it's actually a common practice.
Now, whether it works is an entirely different question.
Not only that, but whether or not it's considered an act of war seems to be a changing opinion. Anyway,
I would argue that it's not.
well, you'd be arguing against Ron Paul. Anyway,
Oh well.
yeah, big shame there.
Occasionally I can disagree with that.
All right, so just tell me, other than the cost of us putting on our own war games, what's the costs or implications economically for the U.S. here?
Well, the thing about sanctions is that, as I stated before, they don't work. I mean, we've been sanctioning, for example, Cuba, a not particularly wealthy, not particularly powerful island nation in the Caribbean, for decades. And the reality is that, yes, we have made the status of life in Cuba probably substantially worse. We've never even come close to toppling the Cuban government. The same is true of North Korea. Sanctions, as a general rule, do not do what they are supposed to do in terms of imposing sufficient political cost to seriously drive differing political paths forward. Now, what they do, and this is a very interesting thing, is that they tend to cut us off economically from important regions of the world. So, as an example of this, and I know I've brought this up on the show before, I'll use the idea of sanctioning Iran. Now, not only in Iran did we end up making a country that otherwise would have pursued economic development much sooner than it did. Right now, it's sort of starting to trend that way, at least. But what we ended up doing is cutting ourselves off from a potentially very major trading partner, and instead of actually benefiting both the United States and Iran in a way that actually could have spurred some kind of stable development in the country, all we ended up doing is radicalizing the government there even more against the United States. It was an absolutely atrocious policy.
And speaking of the orangutan, he's not doing a great job of containing that.
No, not at all. And in fact...
I digress. Not part of the topic.
Well, I do want to say very quickly, the current president of the United States seems not to understand that sanctions don't work. And I would say that he needs to seriously take a look at the last half century of world history, world economic history, to fully grasp that sanctions in an increasingly globalized economy are anachronisms.
Duncan, he has been involved in the world economy since the 80s, in his mind.
He's been involved in the world economy since the 80s.
But it was very localized.
Not in a manner that he ever would have come into.
He thinks he already knows it all, is what I'm saying.
I get that.
So, overall, this is just going to hurt us in the long run. Our reaction to this is...
Or at the very best, it does not actually benefit us. The only potential plus or minus on this, there are potential negatives and there are no potential positives as far as I can see.
Okay, so on to Bryce. Social costs and implications here. What do these war games represent to the U.S. in your mind?
In my mind, exactly what Duncan said, there's nothing really out of the ordinary here. The only thing that I can say is, in a different context, looking at the alleged political influence that Russia has held on the United States and allegedly other countries, although there's less evidence of that. I'm talking about the Russian government buying ads on Facebook to sort of try to sway the American populace one way or the other. It seems like typically to the ultra-right. So, and also, not to mention Russia recently buying radio airspace, having their own radio station in Washington, D.C. And then they also own RT News, which makes a lot of alt-right posts and is super popular among the orangutan fans, trumpeters, whatever you want to call them.
Trumpeters? Oh, boy.
So, in that respect, keep in mind what Abraham Lincoln said when he was quoting the Bible: "A house divided cannot stand." So, like, we're not. Nobody is pro-Russia really in the United States. I mean, not a large majority enough to say that. But I mean, if we're tearing each other's throats out, we can't really defend ourselves against the other superpower.
All right, so gonna move on to closing statements. Who wants to go first?
I will. We never talked about the helicopter missile.
I knew that's something you're gonna put in your closing statement. Is the reason I didn't
Oh, wow.
prompt it. So yeah, go ahead.
That's so Raven. Okay. So in the Russian war games, near St. Petersburg, in a demonstration there, a Russian helicopter shot a missile. It hit a truck, nearly hit lots of civilians and also some military personnel there. Officially, the Kremlin is stating that, yes, the missile hit a truck, but nobody was present near the missile strike. Of course, that's a lie. There is video proof of that.
And we are going to post it.
Yes.
Well, we're not going to post it. We're going to put it in the section below the
Yeah,
video.
we'll post the link.
There you go. That's the word I was searching for in desperation. Thank you, Bryce. Duncan?
So I'm going to go a little bit of an odd direction with my closing statements tonight. This, to me, the general hype that has been seen around these war games, and really just on everything to do with Russia lately, whether it's the people who are just adamantly, as Bryce said, who are watching Russia Today constantly, or who seem to believe without sufficient evidence to back up their positions that in fact the President of the United States is on the payroll of the Kremlin. It seems that everything in this context is being blown out of proportion largely by the magnifying effects of the internet, of social media. This is a problem we haven't really figured out how to deal with. We see more information in an hour online than some of our ancestors would have ever come across in their entire lifetimes. And it's a very novel thing. So I think that people need to become more discerning in how they look at things on social media, even with mainstream news sites. I think they need to not only look at the information, but actually think critically about it and try to put it into a real world context. Because if the real world was the way the internet portrayed it, we'd all be dead. So, dead or punching each other while Peppy the Frog flew around in some sort of amorphous.
Is that not what happened in Charlottesville? I'm confused.
So, my thing is that I think that the hype is more interesting than the event, in that the hype speaks to a very serious trend within our society, to overstate and to allow ourselves to be overstated too. And I think that's the thing that needs to be solved at the individual level. People need to become more intellectually rigorous when it comes to determining the validity of information, how good the information is, and more importantly, how they interpret the information, what they do with it.
All right, so I'm going to take mine in a direction that's almost counter to Duncan's, but it echoes the same sentiment. I would like this not to have legislation on what goes on the internet. I don't want the government getting involved in this.
To be clear,
and I know
neither do I. I want people to put forth personal effort of their own free will.
Because Facebook, which is the largest social media site where most people spend their time on the internet, is already going to reveal who pays for advertisements due to links to Russian advertisements going to far-right groups. They're going to say, okay, we're going to start putting the names of people that pay for these ads out there. That's a big deal. People have the right to privacy, and it's just going to be violated because Facebook can. So,
might I add?
At the end.
Okay, sorry.
So, when you think about this, you have to look at it in a broader context. This isn't, and I know, Bryce, you don't care about whether people paid for ads or if they know you did. Yeah. You don't even care if people know what porn you look at.
Let me just say, me and Ted Cruz have a lot in common.
Oh, God. Is that really what you're going to say the whole time? If I knew how to edit this.
I have to say that I did at one point call it that Bryce was into MILF porn.
So, moving on. Oh, God. I hope your mother doesn't listen to this.
But I'm happy we got here. Continue, Austin.
You know, at this point, I don't even remember. I don't want the government involved is the sentiment I was going to say here. I really just think that's the direction people like to go when they feel that they can't get control on the individual level. They want sweeping laws to come into effect to make them feel safer. I hope that's not what happens here. In any case, we don't have any viewer Q&As because this is releasing. We're recording it on the same day that we just came up with this new format. Please bear with us. If you have any questions, please ask, unless it's about Bryce's preferences.
In which case, ask Bryce, not us.
Yes, send a
I
DM.
do have more to say.
What?
I do have more to say.
Is it about your porn?
No,
I
it's
thought it
about
was about the Ted Cruz thing. Go
no,
ahead.
it's about Facebook.
Okay, go ahead.
Facebook sells people's photos to like businesses in China, and that's all. I mean, it's in the agreement. You check the box. Most people don't really realize that. I guess what I'm saying is, if anything, knowing who's paying for ads is less of an invasion of privacy than selling your photos to people in China.
Okay, thank you. That's all that's on the mind this week. If you have any questions, please comment down below. If you like the video for whatever reason, please like it. If you want to see more, subscribe. I'm sure Duncan and Bryce have more to say about certain subjects that aren't actually the subjects. Anyway, that's all that's on the night. Thank you.
Good evening.
Good night. Good luck.